Hey everyone, Figs here. Hopefully you all got your watercolor kits from the patio, that you got those by emailing me what time you were available and that you could come and pick it up. It should have your name on it. You should have 4 strips, 2 long and 2 shorter of the gum tape. One side of it is affected by hand cutting. So it comes in a roll like this, and we're able to save costs by not giving everyone masking tape. And this is the more traditional way of stretching your watercolor paper anyways. So we're going to go through Watercolor Techniques, and I will have you guys do the 7 of those. And I just traced circles because I don't know if everyone has access to their rulers that they got in their planners at the beginning of the year, that might cause an issue. So you have 4 of these. You have one little watercolor kit with several different colors in here, including some secondary colors, as well as 2 pages of watercolor paper and a chipboard. So let's get into it. Now for your techniques that you're practicing on, I just traced a few circular things in my household. So art works best with odd numbers, and so I did 7. So 7 techniques this time. It's less than usual, but these techniques are some really good ones that use some things around the house. Like if you don't have cling wrap, you could use a Dillon's bag. So cut off a chunk of a Dillon's bag and crumple it up just in that area, and we will get started. Now for my people that have the boards that are a little bit larger, your process for the paper tape is going to be just a little bit different. So your sides this way, so you're still the same concept of finding the straight edge. For your techniques, you do not need to tape it down. That this is just what I'm doing a demonstration of. Okay, so we will go ahead and we will wet the edges. So we will wet here and here. Okay, and then you'll stick it down as straight as possible. Okay, get it all down on the front. Okay, don't stick it down to your table or anything, be careful. All right, and then straight edge again. Which I should probably use my paper towel too for my people that are using paper towel for this one. All right, sticking it down, sticking it down. Now I'm going to use my wet paper towel, and it just helps you to distribute it more evenly than if you were to use just your finger. Okay. So maybe you want to sketch it after you already have an idea of where your tape is going to take up. So mine went all the way to the edges, so some of it might be missing at the end. Some watercolor artists cut it off, the tape. We're going to practice trying to take it off at the end so that you're not losing some of your precious watercolor paper, because watercolor paper is actually pretty expensive, believe it or not, for paper. As far as paper goes, it's the watercolor paper that is usually the expense. Okay, so we will dip, so flip it over when it looks like this, then you'll get the very edges and curl those up over. Okay, like so, like that. That's a reference to Tabitha Brown. She's a huge positive influence on the internet, right? She was popular like back in March. I mean, I'm sure she still is, but I just don't hear about her as much anymore, but I think about her all the time. All right, and we curl it up. If it dries, you'll know that it just won't be quite wet enough. But you don't want to saturate it, because then it really won't do anything for you. That it'll dig in its heels and not want to participate. And we'll just curl this edge as far as it will go, even if it's just little. Okay, make sure I've got my wiggly edges all on the outside. Right, because one of the edges of the paper tape is a straight edge. The other side was hand cut with scissors by Miss Figs. So that can be kind of some trouble. But remember, you don't have to tape down. You won't have enough tape to tape down this as well as this one. This one, you just won't get it super, super saturated. This, your landscape, you definitely want to tape down. All right, so first things first, I am picking out my colors. For my tissue lift is the first one I'm doing here. I'm making a sky and practicing clouds because that's what my landscape image is going to be about, that there's lots of clouds in this. And so it's actually been a little while since I've done watercolor, since March about, that I was wanting to genuinely practice this one some more. So my clouds at the top are usually bigger, and then the ones towards the horizon line get smaller, smaller, smaller as they're farther away. I don't need to do this many clouds. I was just showing. So for some of these, I use in combination of one another on my actual piece. I double checked, and all of these techniques I use for my landscape watercolor in the end. So I mixed some brown down here. It's kind of purplish, so I add some yellow because yellow is the opposite, right? That they're complementary colors. So I've got it going lighter and more, less contrast as it goes back into space. Here I am going ahead and I'm starting on my wet on wet technique. So while this is still wet, I've got to make the foreground or the next layer. This is a really great technique for making trees that are, or mountains in the background that are really, really blurry. So I just chose purple here. They kind of look like veins a little bit, which is pretty cool. I'm using some of the brushes that you guys got in your kits, that I've just got one synthetic hair medium and one synthetic hair small. So you can tell I'm not using those boar's hair brushes that are really scratchy and hard. This one is brush lift, so this one has two components to it, so you kind of want to let it dry a little bit between layers so that you can really get the full effect of it. So my wet on wet will continue to grow, the one that we just finished. This brush lift one, I'm just finishing the design for the base. And then I am cleaning off my brush, letting it cool off for a second. It continues to blend together a little bit. And I'm moving on to cling wrap. I always think that these look like what leaves look like under a microscope or something, or really good at like rock textures. And so I scrunch up the cling wrap or Dylan's bag or whatever, chunk of Dylan's bag maybe, and I put that on the circle and I just let it completely dry. So it might take a few hours even, and I just leave it there. This one is wet on dry. This one you'll get some crispy edges. So you can see my tissue lift is starting to get crispy edges. This one's pretty much the opposite of wet on wet. So that one with the fuzzy looking vein kind of trees at the top, that those are really good forest backgrounds. So I always, with every painting, start with the background, watercolor or otherwise. So this one is no exception here. So I'm just filling in my tree. I'm using kind of a long, thin brush. That these are not quite like Chinese or Japanese script brushes, but I'm just adding some branches to my tree, and that you know that trees at the base are thickest, and then as they move up the branches, those get thicker, and that you can add as much to your tree as you'd like to. That my tree probably should be a little bit taller based on how wide the base of it is. But you can get the gist of the technique here, that the outside edges are crispy and that it's got really nice contrast here. I'm adding some grass here to break up the space so that you can see a separate defined foreground, and that the tree is not foreground but not midground either.
So if you wanted to, you can even add foliage. One way I like to do foliage would be to do some kind of, wet on wet and then let it dry and then do wet on dry for some individual details. But as you go back into space, like your background, you would want it to be blurry, and wet on wet is very good at that. So now we're going back to our brush lift. So what you do with the brush is that you can kind of scrub on the brush. It's hard for me not to do tissue lift on this one, that this one takes longer to do a true brush lift. But the brush lift, you just rub until it's lifting off. Wipe off your brush between layers that you're lifting. That one, I changed the glazing earlier to a dry brush technique just because you've done so much glazing already that you get the concept. Just let the watercolor dry into the paper. So when you saturate the paper, the watercolors that you put into there, when they're absorb deep into the paper. Here I am just drying off my brush in my hand when I should be using one of the rags. Sometimes I like to do straight line techniques like a plaid or that there's kind of an in-between. I chose to use some of the natural hair brushes, which are for showing texture in acrylic paints. And oil paints, but I think that it's interesting texture for dry brush to show wear and tear, or to show that things are more unexpected and experimental. So here for the salt one, while it's still wet, sprinkle the salt on, it dries, and then you shake it off. Be sure to get lots of pigmented paint on that area and make sure that it's pretty wet to do the salt. All right, once everything's dry, brush off the salt and take off the cling wrap, and then you can start wetting the tape around the edges. You want to let it fully absorb the water before you start picking at it. If you're picking at it and it's not just like coming right off, that it's hard to get off. That your feelings are valid in this, but that you should, instead of fighting it, let it come off. I know that that's easier said than done, but if you bend the board a little bit too, that kind of helps. So you can see the areas underneath are dry, which is really interesting. That at first I thought I was tearing the back of it, but it's gooey, that there might be some residue on the board after you're done, and that's okay. But it's kind of satisfying, and it comes off pretty smooth when it's coming off right. So you'll know. When you know, you know. All right, so if it's fighting you, get it wet again, bend the board a little bit. That these boards are probably not going to be reused. That's it for these, because they're so thin and inexpensive, that you can save them to paint on later. That you have that gesso, that if you wanted to make a painting for somebody for Christmas maybe, that you could put it on here. So we're still going for it. It's going to take you a little while, and that's okay. So now with your newfound knowledge, go ahead and let's apply this to our landscapes. Watch the next. Thanks.